Chapter 11. Leaning back in my seat, Moloch inclined his mug in my direction. "You're heavier than you look, my friend, and those swords of yours?" He shook his head. "Why would you want to carry around all that steel? Mine weighs half as much, and it works just fine." I persuaded my head up off the table and scowled at him. "I like my swords," I mumbled. Blinking, trying to wake up, I pushed at the tangle of hair in my face and glanced around. "We're still at the Owl?" "That we are." "And you're still here." "That I am." "I need a drink." I'd be happy to let you give Natalia a try. You can't deny the results." I thought for a moment. "Your sword? You named your sword?" "Why wouldn't I? She's beautiful. She sleeps beside me every night. Most importantly, Natalia never lets me down." Malik pointed an accusing finger at me. "It's no different than you naming your horse." "Everybody names their horse." I motioned for his cup. "Not true," he argued, sliding his drink in my direction. "To give that beast I ride a name would imply that he was tame, which has been proven impossible. I'd have more luck breaking one of those giant bald creatures that run around eating goats in the hills of Arula." Wrapping my hands around the cup, I took a long swallow and looked at him doubtfully. "A skin bear?" "That's the one. Were you aware that Langor used to train their soldiers by throwing them in a ring with those hairless monsters?" The image made me grin. "I'd like to see that." Actually, so would I, but the practice died out about 50 years ago. Someone with a smidge of intelligence finally realized the realm had more lame men than fighting men. Of course, they couldn't have been that smart, or they would have shipped the beasts back to Arula instead of turning them loose in the highlands. They don't breed much, thank gods, but they eat. There's not a single mountain goat left in the whole of Langor. Draining the cup, I slammed it down. "Congratulations, Moloch. That was the most pointless conversation I've ever had." His jaw twitched slightly. "I see you left your manners in the swamp." "Right next to my patients." I turned in my seat. We were the only customers in the entire tavern. A little lack of air and everyone goes home. Like I always say, the Kalash have no stamina. My eyes went to one of the broken windows. "It'll be dawn soon." "Tell me about it." Malik picked up his empty mug and tapped it on the table. "Do you realize how many of these I've had to drink waiting for you to wake up? You'd think as much as I've paid the man he could at least bring me something that didn't taste like horse piss." "You didn't have to stay, really," I added, spending the night hunched over a sticky tavern table, unconscious from a healing I didn't ask for, hadn't left me in the best of moods. Neither did being trounced by two of my own kind in a matter of weeks. I wasn't used to being outmatched, and it wasn't doing much for my attitude or my confidence. "But since you are here," I said, "what do you know about Shinri magic?" "That's a vague question." "Why?" "Because I've been talking to myself for weeks, and it isn't helping." "Okay," Malik said slowly with a bemused, sideways glance. "Well, Shinri are one race, but your blood defines and divides you. It limits your magical abilities, which determines your value or lack of it. Take you, for instance. Your mother was a gifted healer, but your father's line was stronger, so you inherited his magic, his skills as a soldier. That's all you can do. You can't alter time or the weather or conjure a drop of water unless you can somehow use it as an offense or defense." He'd give me a lot of details for a vague question, but I let it go. "What about slaves? You clearly have some sort of clout here in Kale. Heard of any unusual lines being bred? Any accidental births?" "Accidental births aren't possible. The breeders are too well trained, too well versed in which lines are dominant." "What if one of us couldn't be classified so neatly?" I asked, thinking of the man that hired Taryn and the woman who invaded my head. "You're all classified, Troy. By blood strength, by line, by status. If you're put into one of the camps, as you are right now, they'd mark you down as a full pedigree soldier with regulated freedom and no previous owners." "Damn. You rattled that off pretty quick." "I don't deal in slaves, Troy, but the world does. It helps to know the language." "I'm betting you know all the languages." "I don't understand." "I think you understand perfectly. Does that mean you finally figured me out?" "I'm working on it." "Mind if I hear what you have so far?" It was a clear challenge. I studied him a moment, then took him up on it. "Your basic features are Langorian, but they've been softened by privileged stock and diluted by what I'm thinking is Raylan blood. That's what slims you down and stretches you out. It gives a thinner shape to your nose and higher brow, tames your hair too, and keeps it from being that foul shade. My hair is black. Not Langorian black. There's little difference. There is to me. There is to a lot of people in Rayla. We aren't in Rayla. We aren't in Langor either. But I suppose that's a good thing, because if we were, someone someone might take offense to that royal arcana ring on your finger and chop it off. Moloch looked down in silence at the dark pearl, and I went on. From the elegance in your Kalish accent and the obvious price of your clothing and weapons, you're connected to King Saren's court. Loosely, though, or you wouldn't be associating with a pariah like me in public. Now that, I said, pausing to point at the clasp on his cloak, that confuses me. I can't figure out how you got your hands on a pin that's supposed to be worn only by the King of Langor, unless you stole it. Not bad. Malik nodded thoughtfully. Your conclusion? Don't have one. Hands on the table, I pushed to my feet. Sorry, Malik, but it's late and I have enough riddles to solve without adding you to the stack. You're right, he said. The clasp was stolen. Draken's is a fake. I sat back down. I'm listening. For generations, the serpent was passed from father to son, from Langorian king to his successor. But all of those years ago, the night Tavian was found dead, the pin disappeared. The heirloom was such a well-known sign of Langor that a replica was crafted and presented to Draken on the day he took the throne. I'm not sure he even knows. The truth is so well hidden. But you know. How? My mother killed King Taven and took the serpent off his body. I laughed. You really have been at the ale the whole time I was out. I have, but that doesn't change the truth. She was held in the dungeon at Keep Darkhorn in the mountains of Langor. It's a particularly unpleasant place for the king's most prized prisoners. I know it is. Batavian died in battle. I've heard the tale a dozen times. And are all the tales of your exploits completely true? I certainly hope not. I let out a weary sigh. You have proof? Moloch looked away. His stare fixed on the wall next to our table. It was no empty wall. It was an empty wall. The wood was rotting and dirty, but as he looked intently at it, I got the feeling he was seeing something far different than the smoke-wrapped walls of a grungy tavern. The pin wasn't the only thing my mother brought out of Darkhorn, he said at last. He looked at me square in the eyes. She brought me. That's where your Langorian ancestry comes from. She conceived in prison. She was raped in prison. Of course. I'm sorry. There were rescue parties. There was no way to breach Taven's defenses. Suspicion crept up my spine. Rescue parties weren't sent that far into Langorian territory for just anyone. She wasn't just anyone. Neither was my father. That didn't stop her from stabbing him in the heart with a table knife. Brave woman. Desperate woman. She was afraid of what I would become raised in that place. By his side. Malik drew in a long, slow breath. He let it out like it hurt. So you see, Troy, you were right. I am a prince. His implications sunk in. You're saying King Taven was your father? He nodded, and my first reaction was to laugh it off. Moloch's claim was outlandish, but looking at him, at his features, how he carried himself, the way the story affected him, it was entirely plausible he was the son of Langor's late queen. And your mother? I'm not sure how she escaped. It's been suggested that Taven was drunk and she stabbed him in his sleep, but the facts remain unknown. It was pure luck the Raylan soldiers even found him. The winter had turned brutal. They were packing up to leave. From what I understand, they shouldn't have been there at all. Their incursion into Langor hadn't been sanctioned by Rayla's king. It was undertaken by a young, idealistic prince desperate to bring his sister home. And it hadn't gone well. Most of his men were dead. Supplies were near gone. The order had been given to mount up when someone spotted her in the snow. Malik tried to stifle it, but a wave of grief thinned his voice. She gave birth to me on the frozen ground in the middle of the Langorian mountains and died an hour later, without ever knowing how her life would impact the world. Hold on. I could feel my headache coming back. Are you suggesting that the prince was Raynan Arcana and that your mother was his sister, Laris? The princess that King Taven kidnapped over 30 years ago? The princess whose infamous capture sparked a 25-year war between Rayla and Langor? I'm not suggesting. So Raynan Arcana is your uncle, and Draken of Langor your brother. Half-brother. I looked at him a long moment. That would make you an heir to both thrones, Rayla and Langor. And you've been living in Kale all this time, unacknowledged and anonymous? You walk around with that ring and that clasp looking as you do, and no one questions it? No one challenges it? This is the first time I've worn them in public. Yeah, I can see where they might cause a stir. Frustrated, I shook my head. So why now? I risk exposing your existence after all this time. Circumstances have made it necessary. I couldn't help it anymore. I let out a short, skeptical laugh. I'm sorry, Malik. King Taven died on the battlefield, and the woman you claim your mother died in prison. Larice Arcana was never rescued, and she never had a child. I'm sitting right here, Troy. Malik leaned in. Because of the shame my existence brought to my Raylan grandfather, because of the Langorians needed to preserve their king's name. The two realms came together and fabricated the story. He threw himself back angrily. And who said Rayla and Longor couldn't find common ground? If there was an agreement, why did the war escalate? Before Taven died, there was talk of a treaty. Yes, and even after Draken was crowned, my grandfather tried to end the hostilities. Both realms had suffered such a great loss. He felt enough blood had been spilled on both sides. Draken felt differently and launched a major strike against Rayla. That raid that came on the heels of Taven's death, the one that nearly burned Khepri to the ground, that was in retaliation for what your mother did. It was. A flash of resentment tore through me. Do you have any idea how many died in that attack? How many were lost to starvation and disease in the weeks after? It was a terrible tragedy. It was a slaughter! I was 6 years old when the Langorians sent Khepri up in flames. I couldn't stop it. I had no real magic yet. I couldn't do a damn thing. I gripped the table to keep from coming out of my seat. I watched the people I was born to protect being butchered in the streets. I watched them burn alive. Quick enough to make my jump, Malik stood. And you were responsible for the deaths of how many men? Can you even count that high? I know what I did, Malik. Believe me. But the repercussions of that woman's actions run just as deep. That attack on Khepri was a turning point in the conflict. If she never killed Taven, I may never have gone to war. Never found the crown of stones. Never used it. 9 years, Malik said, slowly sitting back down. Can you imagine being in prison of Langor for 9 years? What would they do to you? What lengths would you be driven to do? What would you become? He took a long, deep breath and tried to move on. A king's healer was with the rescue party. She delivered me. She kept me warm and nourished. Without her, I would have died too. Whose life did she use to keep you alive? I'm sorry, what? In the army, our healers used captured Langorian soldiers to feed their spells. Old, young, didn't matter, as long as Elagar's troops were restored. I should think that would have made you happy. It did. Malik's lips pursed. Things happen in times of crisis, yes, but from my experience, most healers keep a good stock of animals. If necessary, they use condemned men, but they're already dead. Sorry, Nefarim. But they're very much alive when the spell drains them. So you prefer Sauron's way, then? Using Kalish healers that can't pull out a damn tooth without killing their patients? And mercenaries like you who carry out justice by hunting people like animals? If you act like an animal, you deserve to be hunted like one. Releasing a perturbed breath, Malik peeked in his cup like he forgot it was empty. This particular king's healer, he said, going back to his story, carried me all the way to Rayla. She presented me to the court, where my grandfather declared I was an abomination. After berating his son for even attempting the disastrous rescue, he decreed I be put out and left to die. Nice homecoming. What changed his mind? A young Kalish prince by the name of Connell Rourke. King Saren's brother. Now I was really confused. Isn't he dead? No. Connell was betrothed to my mother. Out of his love for Lularis, he took me in and named me his own. And for that kindness, he was disowned and exiled. We both were. Malik gave me a level stare like he was waiting for me to say something. When I didn't, he said tightly, It was your mother, Ian. Valoria Troy was the king's healer. That saved my life. Did you know? Part of it I did. But saying my mother told me she was there when the Raylands tried to rescue their princess, and admitting that she deceived me about the outcome wouldn't change anything. It certainly wouldn't alter the fact that Malik was staring at me with eyes that resembled Draken's and Raynan and Arcana's all at the same time. So I ditched his question for one of my own. What are you doing here, Malik? If you lent me a hand tonight as repayment for what my mother did, consider your debt settled. Finding a knot on the tabletop, he studied it. A royal messenger is staying at Saren's castle. He hails from Khepri and carries the Arcana seal. Go see him. I don't need to. The messenger is here for you, Troy. If he's here to tell me that Rael is in danger, I already figured that out. Malik's stare lifted. He looked at me. I should speak with that man. I should do a lot of things. Does that mean you aren't going back with him? Of course I'm going back. I have no choice. Rael calls and I answer. And you resent that? I'm under a spell that compels me to fight for a realm that's not my own. Some would say it's no different than a chain around my neck. A chain that hasn't been pulled in a very long time, he reminded me. But I'm sure tramping across the country, stalking Kale's most notorious, is more fulfilling than defending an entire kingdom. It certainly pays well, with all the money you were throwing at the barkeep. My gaze narrowed. You were here from the start. I stepped in when things got bad. It wasn't bad when Daniel was kicking me. I didn't want to swoop in too soon and damage your pride. It wasn't my pride he was damaging. Malik frowned at me. See the messenger, Troy. Then we'll talk. We just did. I slid out from the bench and stood up. I didn't say you had to talk to me now. Sit, he said. I'll tell you all about growing up in Kalish fishing village. It's really far more exciting than it sounds. Almost. I sat back down. It wouldn't hurt anything to spend a little more time with Malik and his past. We could trade jests and insults. I could listen to his stories as he spit them out in bits and pieces. I could maybe make sense of his motives, but the ale was gone, and I wasn't sure I could tolerate him without it. No thanks, I said, and I came here for answers. Malik, not a drinking companion or a bodyguard. I certainly didn't come looking for the exiled half-breed stepson of a Kalish prince. If Malik took offense, he didn't show it. The messenger and I both arrived in Kale about a fortnight ago. Every morning since, he's gone out to the tournament field at some ungodly hour, like this one. Do yourself a favor, though. Don't sneak up on him. He's awfully prickly for a young fellow. I'll keep that in mind. I reached into my pocket and dropped the last of my coins on the table in front of him. Have a round on me, Malik. For Natalia, I added. She did good tonight.